In this episode, we turn to a topic that quietly determines whether any supervised learning result is trustworthy, which is how you define labels and how you treat the idea of ground truth. Beginners often hear ground truth as if it means the label is the unquestionable reality, but in real datasets the label is usually a measurement, and measurements can be ambiguous, inconsistent, and wrong. This matters in cloud security and cybersecurity work because labels often come from incident tickets, analyst judgments, rule triggers, or retrospective investigations, and those processes are imperfect by nature. If you treat noisy labels as perfect truth, your model will learn the noise, and then you will be surprised when it behaves strangely in production. Managing labeling carefully is not about being overly cautious or academic. It is about designing a labeling process that produces useful signals and documenting the uncertainty so stakeholders do not overinterpret the outputs. The goal here is to understand ambiguity, reliability, and measurement error as the core reasons labels go wrong, and to learn how to build workflows that respect those realities. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is to separate the concept of a label from the concept of a fact, because a label is usually a decision made under constraints. In security datasets, a label might be malicious or benign, but what counts as malicious can depend on policy, context, and timing. An event that looks benign today may be reclassified later when more evidence appears, and an event that looks malicious might actually be a legitimate administrative action that was simply unusual. Labels can also represent more complex categories, like severity levels or incident types, and those categories can overlap or be interpreted differently by different teams. Beginners often assume that if two analysts disagree, one must be wrong, but disagreement can be a sign that the labeling definition is unclear or that the evidence is incomplete. This is why labeling begins with clear label definitions and decision criteria, not with the act of clicking a category. A professional labeling process recognizes that reality is messy, and it builds rules that handle the mess in a consistent way. When you define labels with precision, you reduce future confusion and you make model training far more stable. Ambiguity is the first major challenge, and it shows up when the same data point could reasonably be assigned multiple labels depending on interpretation. In cloud security, a single behavior can be suspicious in one context and normal in another, such as a large data transfer that is malicious exfiltration for one user but a legitimate backup for another. Ambiguity also appears when labels represent outcomes rather than actions, because the same action can lead to different outcomes depending on downstream events. For example, an unusual login might be labeled benign if nothing happened afterward, but that does not mean the login itself was harmless. It might simply mean the attack failed. Beginners sometimes try to eliminate ambiguity by forcing every case into one bucket, but that can create misleading labels that hide uncertainty and reduce learning quality. A better approach is to recognize ambiguous cases and decide how to treat them, such as using an uncertain category, excluding them from certain training sets, or capturing additional context that makes the decision clearer. Ambiguity management is not weakness. It is a way to preserve honesty in the dataset. When your label set acknowledges ambiguity, your model outputs become easier to interpret responsibly. Reliability is the second major challenge, and it refers to how consistently different people or processes apply the same label definitions. Two analysts can look at the same event and choose different labels if the criteria are vague, if they have different experience, or if they see different supporting evidence. In some datasets, labels are not applied by humans at all, but by automated rules, and rule-based labels can be consistent yet still unreliable in the sense that they do not correspond well to the intended concept. Beginners often assume that consistent labels are automatically good labels, but consistency can simply reflect a rigid rule that misclassifies many cases. Reliability also includes stability over time, because definitions can drift as policies change, tooling changes, or threat landscapes evolve. In cloud environments, A behavior labeled suspicious last year might become normal after a new workflow is adopted, and if labels do not adjust thoughtfully, the dataset becomes internally inconsistent. Measuring and improving reliability often requires calibration, such as having multiple labelers label the same sample and comparing their agreement. Even without formal statistics, the core idea is that labels should be reproducible, and when they are not, you must treat the dataset as uncertain and design accordingly. Measurement error is the third major challenge, and it is the idea that labels can be wrong not because people are careless, but because the underlying truth is hard to observe. In security, many events are never fully investigated, so benign labels can actually mean not proven malicious rather than truly safe. Some incidents are discovered long after they occur, which means earlier events may be mislabeled because the outcome was unknown at the time. Logs can also be incomplete, so a label might be based on partial evidence, like a missing record that would have changed the conclusion. Beginners sometimes think measurement error is rare, but it is common in complex operational domains where the true state of the world is not directly measurable. Measurement error also includes misclassification caused by mislabeled training examples, which can lead a model to learn incorrect associations. In cloud security, this can create dangerous failure modes where the model becomes less sensitive to real threats because threats were labeled benign in the past due to misdetection. Understanding measurement error helps you treat labels as estimates, not as certainties. When you respect measurement error, you design training and evaluation that is more robust and less misleading. Label definitions should be treated like an engineering artifact, meaning they should be written clearly, versioned, and maintained over time rather than living as tribal knowledge. A professional label definition includes what evidence is required, what evidence is disallowed, what counts as insufficient evidence, and how to handle edge cases. In security data, evidence might include correlated alerts, known compromise indicators, or verified incident response outcomes. But even then, the definition must clarify whether the label applies to an event, a session, a user, or an incident, because those are different units of analysis. Beginners often label whatever record is convenient, then later discover they trained a model to predict a label at the wrong level. For example, labeling individual log events as malicious because they occurred during a malicious incident can create label leakage because the model may learn incident context rather than event-level maliciousness. A careful approach defines the labeling unit and ensures the evidence used to label is available and appropriate for that unit. Label definition quality determines not only model performance, but also explainability, because you cannot explain a model well if the label itself is vague. Treating label definitions as disciplined documentation is a core part of managing ground truth responsibly. Labeling workflows also need to consider who labels, how they label, and what incentives shape their decisions. In many organizations, labels come from incident tickets, and tickets are influenced by operational workload, triage priorities, and what gets investigated. That creates selection bias, meaning the labeled dataset may overrepresent certain types of events simply because they were more visible or more likely to be escalated. Beginners often assume labeled data is a random sample of reality, but in security, it is usually a biased sample shaped by detection, tooling, and human attention. This bias can cause a model to learn to predict what gets investigated rather than what is truly risky. Another workflow issue is that labelers may have different access to context, such as one analyst seeing raw logs and another seeing only summarized alerts, which leads to inconsistent labeling even if they are equally skilled. A professional approach standardizes labeling interfaces and context where possible, so labelers make decisions from a consistent evidence set. It also includes review processes for disagreements and mechanisms for updating labels when new information arrives. When you design labeling as a process, you reduce hidden bias and improve reliability. A common beginner misunderstanding is to treat ground truth as a binary switch, as if each example is either correctly labeled or incorrectly labeled with no nuance. In practice, it is often more honest to treat labels as having confidence levels or degrees of certainty, especially in domains where evidence can be partial. You might have labels that are confirmed, probable, possible, or unknown, or you might have separate fields that capture investigation status versus final outcome. Even if your model ultimately needs a binary label, Capturing uncertainty in the dataset helps you make better choices about what to train on and how to evaluate. For example, you might train primarily on confirmed labels and use uncertain labels for secondary analysis or semi-supervised exploration. This reduces the chance that the model learns from weak evidence and becomes overconfident. In cloud security, this is particularly important because false certainty can lead to automation bias, where teams trust model outputs too much. A careful labeling strategy acknowledges uncertainty rather than hiding it, which leads to safer decision-making. When the dataset reflects uncertainty honestly, the model can be positioned as decision support rather than as a truth engine. Reliability can be strengthened through practices that reduce subjective variation and encourage consistent decisions. Clear guidelines help, but guidelines alone are not enough because real cases include edge conditions that test definitions. Training labelers, creating example libraries of difficult cases, and establishing escalation paths for uncertain decisions can improve consistency over time. Another powerful approach is double labeling, where two independent labelers label the same case and disagreements trigger review, which helps detect ambiguous definitions and inconsistent interpretation. Even in automated labeling, you can improve reliability by using multiple signals, such as combining rule triggers with investigation outcomes, rather than relying on one brittle source. For beginners, the key is to see reliability as something you can engineer, not as a fixed property of a dataset. In security analytics, improving reliability often reduces false positives and increases trust because teams see the system behaving consistently. Reliability work also produces better training data for future models because patterns become clearer when labels are applied consistently. When you treat reliability as an objective, you build datasets that can support stable learning. Measurement error also needs active management, and that includes recognizing where labels are likely to be wrong and designing checks that detect it. One useful idea is to look for label noise patterns, such as cases where similar examples have different labels or where the same entity flips labels frequently without a clear reason. In cloud security, you might see an account that is labeled benign for many suspicious sessions until a later confirmed incident triggers a label change, revealing that earlier labels were not truly benign, but simply uninvestigated. Another measurement error pattern is when a new detection tool changes what incidents are discovered, causing label distribution shifts that reflect detection capability rather than threat change. Beginners might interpret that shift as a real surge in attacks, but it could be a surge in visibility. Managing measurement error includes designing feedback loops where investigations update labels and where models are retrained with corrected outcomes, but it also includes cautious evaluation that accounts for uncertain negatives. Professionals avoid claiming that the model predicts maliciousness with certainty when the dataset cannot observe maliciousness perfectly. When you communicate measurement limitations clearly, you protect stakeholders from overinterpreting performance metrics. Ground truth also has a time dimension that beginners often miss, which is that truth can be revealed gradually. At the time an event occurs, it might be unlabeled, then later labeled based on investigation, and then later relabeled based on new evidence. That means your dataset can contain labels that were assigned at different times with different information, creating inconsistency if you treat them as uniform. In security contexts, this is common because incident discovery and root cause analysis can take time, and the label might apply to an incident window rather than to a single event. A professional labeling strategy includes timestamping labels and tracking label versions so you know what was known when the label was assigned. This matters for model training because you must avoid using future information as features, and label timing helps prevent accidental leakage. It also matters for evaluation because a model might appear to make false positives that later become true positives once investigation catches up. Beginners often judge the model too early without recognizing that ground truth is delayed. When you incorporate timing into your labeling approach, you create a dataset that supports fairer training and more realistic expectations. Managing labels carefully also includes thinking about how labels connect to privacy and fairness, because labeling decisions can affect people directly. If a model trained on noisy labels starts flagging certain user groups more often due to biased investigation patterns, you can create harmful feedback loops where those groups are investigated more, producing more labels, reinforcing the model's bias. This is not a purely ethical argument. It is also a quality argument because biased labels create biased learning, which reduces generalization and increases false alarms. In cloud security, privacy concerns arise when labeling requires collecting sensitive details or when labeled datasets are shared widely beyond the team that needs them. Professionals therefore apply least privilege to labeled datasets and separate identifiers from features where possible, using pseudonymous IDs for modeling while keeping re-identification restricted to authorized investigation workflows. They also consider whether the labeling process itself is fair, meaning whether different populations receive comparable investigation attention and evidence thresholds. Beginners may not be responsible for policy decisions, but understanding that labeling can embed bias helps you interpret models responsibly. A careful approach makes both the model and the organization safer. Bringing these ideas together, managing labeling and ground truth carefully means recognizing that labels are measurements with ambiguity, reliability challenges, and measurement error, especially in cloud security datasets where truth is hard to observe. Ambiguity arises when context changes meaning and when evidence is incomplete, so you must define labels clearly and decide how to handle uncertain cases. Reliability depends on consistent application of definitions across people and time. So labeling should be treated as a process with calibration, review, and documentation rather than as a one-time step. Measurement error is inevitable because investigations are incomplete and truth is delayed. So your training and evaluation must respect uncertainty and avoid overclaiming what the model can know. When you version label definitions, track label timing, and design workflows that reduce bias and protect privacy, you create ground truth that is as truthful as the real world allows. This careful foundation makes downstream models more stable, explanations more honest, and operational decisions more defensible. That is what it means to manage labeling professionally, and it is a core competency for anyone building data-driven systems in cybersecurity and cloud environments.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.